When most people hear the term Wild West, they typically think of cowboys herding cattle across the vast plains. Maybe a shootout at high noon, or a stagecoach rumbling along a dusty trail. These images have been seared into our brains thanks to Hollywood's portrayal of the era. But what if I told you that the reality was actually much different? While there are some truths to these depictions, like the fact that people did wear cowboy hats and boots, the reality was much more grim than what you see in the movies. And it wasn't all saloons and six-shooters. From disease-ridden slums to the stench of human waste coating everything, here's 11 things that Hollywood got wrong about the Wild West. Number 11. Disease. While we may associate the Wild West with gunfights and outlaws, it was actually a disease that was the greatest killer of settlers moving west. In the early days, the primary mode of transportation was by wagon train. These trains consisted of multiple wagons traveling together for safety in numbers, usually led by an experienced guide. The problem was that these wagons were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and exposed to the elements. Add to that the prevalence of diseases like cholera, typhoid fever, and smallpox, which could spread quickly in these conditions, and you have a recipe for disaster. Many pioneers succumbed to these diseases, which caused entire wagon trains to be wiped out. This grim reality was immortalized in a painting called The Last of the Akamas, depicting the devastating impact of disease on a Native American tribe. No, 10 cities were filthy. When you think of a Wild West town, you might picture a bustling frontier outpost filled with cowboys, prospectors, and merchants. While this is partially true, another important aspect was how dirty these cities were. Back then, sanitation was not a top priority, and waste disposal was minimal at best. Garbage and human waste would accumulate in the streets, making them a breeding ground for disease and pests. To make matters worse, most buildings lacked proper ventilation and indoor plumbing. So residents had to deal with the unpleasantness of it all indoors too. It was not uncommon for people to share a single outhouse for an entire block, and those outhouses were rarely cleaned. To put it bluntly, living in a Wild West city meant enduring a constant state of filth and disease. 9. There were no sidewalks. Can you imagine walking down a busy street without the safety of sidewalks? Well, during the Wild West era, this was a common sight. Streets were often the only thoroughfare, serving as the main mode of transportation for both people and animals. Because of this, pedestrians had to dodge horse-drawn carriages, wagons, and the occasional cow or pig wandering through the town. This created a chaotic and dangerous environment, especially since most street lighting was inadequate or non-existent. It wasn't until the late 1800s that some cities began to construct sidewalks, providing much-needed relief from the hazards of street walking. Number 8. Women faced danger. The romanticized version of the Wild West often conjures up images of rugged cowboys and daring adventures. However, this era was perilous for women who faced unique dangers that set them apart from their male counterparts. For starters, there were significantly fewer women in the West than men, meaning that when a woman did enter a saloon, she immediately became the center of attention. This unwanted attention often bordered on harassment and could easily turn violent. Additionally, women were vulnerable to sexual assault and exploitation in a society that offered limited legal protections. And it wasn't just strangers that posed a threat. Even in their own homes, women were not safe from the dangers of the time period. Without proper locks on doors and windows, it was not uncommon for women to be attacked inside their own homes. Number 7. Slavery still existed. Though slavery had been abolished in the United States with the 13th Amendment in 1865, it still persisted in certain parts of the country, including some areas of the Wild West. The majority of slaves in the U.S. were owned in the southern states, but there was also a smaller population of enslaved people in western territories. Some of these slaves were the descendants of Native Americans who had been captured and sold into slavery, while others were African Americans who had escaped from the South or were brought to the West Coast for mining or domestic work. Despite being illegal, slavery in the Wild West continued due to a combination of factors, including the lack of law enforcement and the economic dependence on slave labor. As late as the 1890s, there were still an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 enslaved people in Texas alone. Number 6. Law enforcement was non-existent. The phrase "anything goes" perfectly encapsulates the law enforcement situation in the Wild West. In many towns, law enforcement was either non-existent or ineffective, leading to a rise in crime and lawlessness. There weren't enough resources or personnel to adequately cover the vast territories. The ones who did serve were often underpaid, poorly trained, and susceptible to bribery or intimidation. What little law enforcement did exist was frequently overshadowed by the prevalence of vigilantes, who took it upon themselves to dispense justice. This lack of accountability led to a climate of fear and violence where people were often too afraid to speak out against crimes or seek justice through legal means. Number 5. The cattle drives. The cattle drives of the Wild West are often depicted as epic journeys across the plains filled with cowboys herding thousands of cattle over hundreds of miles. But the reality was much different. Most cattle drives were relatively short, lasting only a few days and covering distances of no more than 50 miles per day. The cattle were driven at a slow pace, forcing the cowboys to spend weeks, even months, on the trail. Contrary to popular belief, cowboys didn't ride horses during long drives. Instead, they walked alongside the cattle, occasionally switching to horseback riding for short periods. They also didn't sleep in fancy chuck wagons as portrayed in the movies. Instead, they slept on the ground under the stars, cooking their meals over open fires. The reality of cattle driving was much more arduous and less glamorous than Hollywood would have you believe. Number 4. Hollywood cowboys wore the wrong boots. You might be surprised to learn that the iconic cowboy boots you recognize today were not actually worn during the Wild West era. Those who lived through that time typically wore a simpler style of boot made from leather or canvas. These boots were designed for functionality rather than aesthetics, and were often customized to fit the wearer's needs. They featured a low heel and a round toe, and were made from materials that were durable and easy to maintain on the trail. Unlike their modern counterpart, these boots were not as decorative and didn't include intricate stitching or embellishments. In fact, they were primarily used for practical purposes, such as herding cattle or riding horses. Today, however, cowboy boots have evolved into a symbol of Western fashion and are often worn for special occasions or as a way to pay homage to the history of the Old West. Number 3. The cost of living was high. If you ever find yourself daydreaming about life in the Wild West, be sure to factor in the cost of living before you pack your bags. During the 1800s, prices in frontier towns were notoriously high, making it difficult for settlers to establish a comfortable life on the frontier. Basic necessities like food and clothing were in short supply, leading to inflated prices that strained the budgets of even the most affluent pioneers. This economic hardship was exacerbated by the lack of infrastructure and the difficulty in transporting goods to remote settlements. As a result, settlers often had to rely on expensive alternatives, such as purchasing items from traveling merchants or paying exorbitant prices to transport goods from distant cities. This economic strain was a significant challenge for those seeking a better life in the Wild West, reminding us that the romanticized image of the era doesn't always align with the realities of life on the frontier. Number 2. Stagecoaches were common. One of the most enduring images of the Wild West is that of a stagecoach rumbling along a dusty trail, pursued by outlaws, or perhaps carrying a damsel in distress. This iconic mode of transportation has been immortalized in countless films and TV shows. But what if I told you that this image is largely a product of Hollywood's imagination? In reality, stagecoach travel was much less common than what's portrayed in the media. Stagecoach routes were typically confined to major roads between settlements, and there were far fewer stagecoach companies operating during the Wild West era than one might imagine. The reality of stagecoach travel was much more limited and less frequent than what's often portrayed in popular culture. Number 1. Firearms were not as advanced. Hollywood has a knack for creating larger-than-life images of the Wild West, and firearms are no exception. The six-shooters wielded by cowboys and outlaws in old Western films seem almost magical, firing off multiple rounds with ease and accuracy. However, the truth is that these guns were not as advanced as they're portrayed on screen. In reality, most firearms of the era were single-shot weapons, meaning that after each discharge, the user had to manually reload before firing again. Furthermore, the accuracy and reliability of these guns were not as advanced as what we see in movies. In fact, many early firearms were notoriously inaccurate, often missing their mark by several feet. The romanticized image of the Wild West often obscures these realities. giving us a distorted view of the challenges and limitations faced by those who lived during that time period. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out more content. With that said, see you next time.